So welcome. I am so excited to welcome Eric Harper class. Eric, hi, how's it going? Welcome.
Hi,
Um,
everyone.
so yeah, many of you already know Eric, who founded Submit It, which is a service for writers who need help with editing, who need help with submitting their workplaces. I will let Eric discuss it in more detail, but I just want to say I've worked with Eric as an editor. He is a wonderful editor, and he also makes revising fun. For me, revising is like my least favorite part of writing, and he's made it just like a pleasure to work on the craft. So, yeah. So, Eric, why don't you tell us a bit about Submit It, your company for people who don't know, and then tell us in particular what you look for in story openings and what you were sort of broadly looking for in these stories here.
Totally. Yeah. First of all, I feel like at least half of you know me already, so I'll keep this relatively short. But about 4 years ago, I started a company with the goal of helping writers submit to literary journals. It really wasn't about editing, but pretty early on, I realized that just from simply reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of short stories to prepare my database for the submission side of the company, I was learning a lot about what to look for in stories, what journals are looking for, and it just made a lot of sense for me to also become an editor. And so now I've been editing for almost half a decade. I love doing it. Um, so that's kind of it. So we're an editing company and a submission company. And again, I know about half of you know me, and I recognize so many names, which I think is really cool. Um, so what am I looking for openings? Um, so I started thinking about this in a analytical way rather than just sort of a general way. And I didn't actually come up with anything particularly new. I just kind of want to be hooked. I want to know what's at stake pretty early on. Um, and I sort of made a few assumptions. And Becky, I have some sample stories that I'll just read openings from a pushcart eventually if we have time. But I'm first of all assuming that we're submitting to literary journals, not to not to genre, literary writing, so not genre writing, creative nonfiction and literary fiction. I'm assuming we're not famous. So this is kind of interesting because I read short story collections all the time, and I find that the openings of famous short stories by famous short story writers don't necessarily have to hook us on in the first paragraph or even on the first page because we kind of, I guess, just trust them, you know? I don't know if you guys ever write a short story without worrying about getting it submitted and accepted to literary journals, but I do sometimes. And I just think, oh, I'm going to kick the reader in the ass in my first few paragraphs. And I don't care if they don't know what's going on because I'm not going to submit this one. It might sit in a collection of mine someday. So our assumption is that we're submitting to literary journals. Number two, we're not famous. And number three, we don't have an agent bribing Deborah Treisman at the New Yorker to get our work in. So thus, I do think we need to hook the reader pretty quick. Of the stories that I reviewed in Pushcart, most of them had the hook literally in the first sentence. Like you could read the first sentence, I'll give you some examples, and we're in. If we're not hooked in that first sentence, I find that by the second or third paragraph, depending on how long the paragraphs are, there's this point where I could underline it and say, this is why we're going to keep reading. So it happens fast, and I think the idea is we're trying to not just get the editor or the reader of the journal to keep reading, but we're also trying to set this first impression, I think, um, and give them a feeling of, oh, I'm into this story. I think, and Becky, you tell me if you agree. I think most editors say that they read through most work. So it's not like I think we need to greatly worry about somebody saying, "Oh, I'm not going to read another word of this one." So first impressions really become part of it as well, hooking and creating that good first impression. Um, what else? Um, I noticed some things while I was reading the push cart. First of all, I'm almost never confused on that first page. I feel like all of these writers are easing us into the story in kind of in terms of the syntax. Um, that doesn't mean that there's not tension, and it doesn't mean we don't want to know what's going on, but none of them did I read the first page and think, God, I'm uncomfortably confused.
Mhm.
And yet that's something I feel a quarter of the time or so when I'm editing. And I so often in my notes write, I don't, this is confusing, or just cut this and get into where you're going sooner. The other thing I noticed is when there isn't a real obvious hook, when I'm not completely grabbed by content, I'm grabbed by style and or form.